Another Intigriti challenge completed, this time a much shorter one than usual, but I think it's still important to go through the process so people can kind of get an understanding on what the process is to solve a challenge like this. But I do definitely think this is one of the easier challenges released by Intigriti, so I strongly recommend anyone who's trying to get into solving challenges like this and into web security to just pause the video and give it a go yourself, because it's definitely on the easy side. It's definitely achievable by most people who just have a decent understanding of JavaScript, and it's also super fun. So the functionality is just really simple. We just type in our name here, we select if we play it or not, and we enter, and our name gets reflected in the page. And we can also see at the top here that our values get put into the URL as URL parameters. And that's basically it for the functionality. Super simple. So let's just get stuck into the code. So this first function here, show modal, we're going to see how that gets called later. So I'm just going to skip over that for now, and we'll see how it gets used. And we're just going to skip straight down into this onSubmit event handler. So looking at the onSubmit handler, we see that it's just literally taking the value straight out of the form, and it's just going to check if it's over 24 characters, and if it's not, then it's just going to call this line here, window.location.search, and it's basically just creating these URL parameters out of the values that you passed in here. So you can see if it fails any of these checks here, it goes on to the show modal function, where it's basically passing in this title and this content, right? So if we just pass in a completely empty one, we'll see that we get this error, it's empty. And we can see inside of the show modal function, those two values are getting set in the web page using inner HTML. However, every time inside of this onSubmit handler that it's calling show modal, it's just using hard-coded strings. There's no user input that's being passed in. So generally, there's not really anything interesting going on in this onSubmit function. It's literally just checking every time you submit the form and then setting these values in the URL. That's all it's doing. So the main stuff we're interested in is what runs here every time the page loads outside of those functions. So first it's just doing a check to make sure that this queue parameter is present, which would have been set as part of this onSubmit handler. So then it's just setting up a variable called URI, which is just the entirety of this URL, but URI decoded. And then it's setting up a new variable called QS, which is attempting to, in a very horrible way, pass out this value here, HG, right? We can check that here if we type in QS. So then it's just going to check if QS is over the length of 24, and if it is, it throws an error, and if it isn't, then our user input gets passed into show modal as the second parameter, which here is content, and then that gets rendered directly using inner HTML. So now we can start to make a few observations. The first one being that there is only one XSS sync on the page, which is inner HTML. It's being called in two different places, but only one of those cases, which is inside of content, does our user input get passed in. And that gets passed in here as part of our QS variable. So we can already tell that the value of Q here is going to be passed directly into the page via inner HTML as long as it is not over 24 characters long. So we can test and make sure that we can actually get HTML injection by just doing something that is very short, like S for strike through, and here we can see the text does get strike through'd. So HTML injection is no use to us unless we can inject our own scripts, right? So let's say we want to inject our own script tags. Well, we need to make sure that this is no longer than 24 characters. And already these two script tags make up 17. Even if we wanted the simplest alert payload, we're already going over. So before we can even think about potentially writing JavaScript, we need an HTML payload that is going to result in JavaScript execution that is as short as possible. So that brings me on to this GitHub page by a researcher called Turjan Q, and this has a lot of very useful and very tiny XSS payloads. So if we take one of those payloads, for example this SVG, and we put it into a string and we remove the JavaScript that's inside it, because at the moment we're only interested in the HTML part, and we'll write our own JavaScript, and we can see we're now down to 13 characters, which gives us 11 characters of JavaScript to put in here. So let's just try and make sure that we know it works. We pass in an alert to 1, and we copy that payload here and put that in where we used our strike through, and we can see that we did get an alert 1. But alert 1 is not very useful. What's the point in alerting 1? If we try to write any more useful JavaScript in here, we'll hit that 24 character limit. So we need a way to be able to run more code. So another way we could try to do this is try to store our payload somewhere that the small amount of JavaScript we can execute here can reach it and then pass that data into eval, right? So if we could somehow store a string that we could then retrieve later on, then we could pass that into eval and have it execute as JavaScript. But where exactly could we store a string that the JavaScript context has access to? Maybe we could reuse something inside of the script. So looking through the code, we can quickly dismiss most of this code because the code is executing inside of a function. So all the variables that are getting declared are just scoped to that function. So we need to pay attention to what exists in this main scope. And so that brings us on to these two variables here. So QS is a place where we can store whatever input we want, but we can't use QS because one, that's being used to execute our tiny 11 character payload, and for two, it can't be more than 24 characters long. So that brings us on to URI, this variable here, and it's literally just a URI decoded part version of this URL up here. So if we just check what that looks like, it's literally exactly that, right? So we do have somewhat control over what happens up here, but of course we can't control every aspect of it. We still need to be staying on this web page. So let's see what happens if we put this into a JavaScript context, right? Let's just take the entire thing and paste it into our console. And we can already see that a huge portion of this can pretty much be disregarded because it's being treated as a JavaScript comment because of the double slash as part of the URL. So all we need to really worry about is this part here. So let's see if this actually runs, right? Let's put this into an eval and see what happens, right? So we pass that into an eval and we get unexpected end of input. And we see the same thing here. Most of the code is getting commented out, but this part is failing. So is it failing because this is just invalid JavaScript and we couldn't possibly make a payload out of this, or can we work with this? And I can tell you that actually this is valid JavaScript, right? So this colon syntax that we see here, it's just a label statement, and I won't go into details exactly what it's for. It's a pretty obscure part of JavaScript, but it doesn't really matter, right? It's just failing because it expects something after it. But the problem is that everything after it is being commented out by these double slashes, right? So we need a way to break out of that. Well, since this is being decoded, we can just put a URI encoded new line at the end of this, right? So if we put a new line at the end of this, hopefully we should be writing on a new line now. And that label is just going to act as a label. So now we should just be able to write the rest of our code. So now if we try and do something more interesting, like document.domain, so now all we need to do is edit this onload part here and change it from alert1 to eval URI. So now in theory, when I hit enter on this, Q should be less than 24 characters and then should therefore be put straight into the page. And then that onload handler will hit and will try to eval the entire URI. That will then comment out everything up until this new line, and then when it hits this new line, it's going to run the next line of JavaScript, which is our alert document.domain, which is much over 24 characters. So if we hit enter, we'll see, yes, in fact, we managed to bypass that length limit, and we can now execute whatever JavaScript we want. And that's basically it. Challenge completed. Thanks again for watching.